Welcome back, adventurers. I am the Lore Keeper, this is the Fantasy Forge, and today we're talking about running a D&D game like it's a movie. Let me explain. When I run a session, there's one mindset I always keep in mind, and it's what helps me turn my games into an experience rather than just another session. And that's thinking of my games like they're mini movies. Okay, technically a TV show is probably a better comparison since campaigns are episodic, but mini movies sounds cooler for the title, so let's just roll with it. So let's talk about how I turn my sessions into mini shows / movies that keep my players hooked and also create an experience for everyone at the table, and more than that, also just inherently sets me up for success from one session to the next. So first of all, let's talk about how to break a session into, let's call them acts. Act 1, 2, and 3 are going to make up our first tip for today. Now, when you think about Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 of a story or a film, you can really categorize them into the normal world, which is Act 1, the rising action or tension, and that's Act 2, and then the resolution, which is Act 3. Now, for the sake of D&D, we're going to rename them, but with the same overarching goals. So Act 1 will be our, let's call it a spawn point, which is basically where you're going to pick up from whatever happened in the last session. This can also be seen as the sort of checkpoint, so if every session ends with the players saving the game, then the beginning of the next session is the sort of loading screen and the recap. Now, at the start of every session, I like to give a brief, and I do mean brief breakdown of what happened last time. Usually this is about a paragraph or less, just enough to refresh their memories, set the tone, and get back into the mindset of the game. I avoid long recaps because I want the players to be engaged and in the present moment, not just reminiscing about what already happened. Now, this part of the session should establish where we're coming from, so the players have a clear idea of what they need to prepare for. So if they ended the last session in the middle of a chase, they should immediately feel the urgency of that chase. If they left off after discovering a shocking betrayal, then that tension should still be hanging in the air. It's also important to use this time to sort of reignite the mood. So if the last session was super chaotic, I don't just say, so last time you fought a bunch of guards. Instead, I remind them how it felt. So I might say something like, last time the air was thick with smoke as the town's bells were ringing out in an alarm. The guards were shouting as you were sprinting through the alleyways, your lungs were burning as you were running, and now, just ahead, you see that your only chance to escape is this half-open sewer grate beneath the street. What do you do? And the reason for this is simple. When you describe what happened from a bird's eye view, you aren't getting as immersed then as if you're describing it to them as if they were there in that moment as you narrate it. So that's just a little subtle technique that I like to use to help get everyone pulled right back in simply and efficiently. Now, Act 2 is what we call the rising action. So now that the players are back in the world and they're engaged and we move into that second act of our session, this is where the rising tension starts to build. This is where things will escalate, where those challenges are going to emerge, and this is where the players are going to feel the weight of their decisions and everything that happened in the previous session. So if Act 1 is the spawn point where they orient themselves, then Act 2 is when the game actually begins. This is the section of the session that feels like the heart of the movie or the session or the episode or whatever we're calling it at this point. This is the part where that tension, all of those mysteries, all of those obstacles, those all kind of come to the surface. This doesn't mean you're throwing them straight into combat every single time. I don't want you to think that every session has to have combat. Tension doesn't have to be about fighting. It can come from a difficult choice or an unexpected consequence. Or it could just be a moral dilemma. So maybe there's an NPC that they trust that suddenly starts to act suspicious. Or maybe the path that they planned to take is no longer an option. You could also have something like if there's an item that they just recovered and they realize that it's actually more dangerous than they thought. So one of the most effective ways of building this kind of tension is to introduce complications that force their engagement. So if the players have a clear goal, let's say they're infiltrating a noble's estate, they're trying to steal a document or whatever, I don't just let them roll stealth and if they succeed then they move on. Instead, I'll add layers to that situation. Maybe they overhear a conversation that changes what they thought they knew, and maybe now they don't want to steal that thing anymore. Or maybe there's a guard that recognizes one of them from a past job. Maybe there's a noble they were expecting to be there is actually not there, and instead they found somebody else that's been waiting for them. The key here is that things shouldn't go exactly as planned. If they do, then there's no tension, and there's no surprises, and there's no stakes. And that rising tension, or at least that rising tension phase of the campaign, is where players will start to make those real decisions, where the game and the game world starts to kind of push back against them. And that's where they realize that what's happening is bigger than they expected, that there's more to the story. Also, pacing is super crucial in Act 2, in the middle of your session. If the session starts to feel a little too slow, then I'll introduce a turning point, something that forces them to act. If things are moving too quickly and they haven't had time to process, then I slow things down a little bit to give them some quiet moments to reflect. And balancing that fast-paced action with the slow burn tension makes that session feel like a well-placed movie rather than just a series of encounters. So Act 2 is that build-up to that moment where everything starts to boil over. So the players really should feel like something is coming for them, like something is happening. They shouldn't know exactly when or how or what it is. It's just that that's what keeps them on edge and fully engaged. Now, one note here is that when I say the climax for the episode or the session, it doesn't always have to be some crazy event. Sometimes it's just role-playing. Sometimes it's just shopping. But at the end of the day, the players are playing a game, and at some point you have to introduce things for them to play. So that means puzzles, that means conflict, story, mechanics for them, right? Otherwise, they're just in an improv circle, and if that's your thing, then awesome, but at least for me, I try to plan some sort of major event to take place, even if it's just a baby step towards the next plot point in the game. Or at the very least, a random encounter. This way, every episode or session, just to keep in line with the theme here, has an intro and an Act 2, which is that ramp up towards the action. And then we get to the Act 3, which is the resolution, the hook for the next session, right? At some point in the session, the rising tension has to snap, and this is that moment that everything that has been building up in the session, the confrontation, that reveal, the victory, or that really bad failure, that crushing failure, and also ultimately, sometimes it's also just a reward, like a magic item or a level up even, right? So this could be a climactic battle, it could be a revelation to them that pushes that main story forward, or it's just a choice that has some consequences, like you accidentally leave someone behind, or they are interacting with an NPC that is now being hunted just for getting involved with the players in the first place, and that creates some interesting moral dilemmas for them. The point is that once that movement in the story starts to happen, I don't just let that session end there, right? Once I have that moment, I try to transition the session into the resolution. So towards the last half of the game, or the session, I should say, depending on how many hours you're putting in. If you're doing a 6-hour session, then maybe around the 5-hour mark, I might start gearing up for that resolution for that Act 3. Because that's where the players start to see the aftermath of what has happened in the session. So if they defeated an enemy, what do they find in that wreckage? If they failed a mission, what does that failure mean for them? If they made a deal with somebody, then maybe they find out that deal wasn't really worth it. Again, this is where I show them those consequences for those choices, and those consequences should always be interesting enough that they push the story forward. And the trick, for me at least, is that a session shouldn't feel like the end of the story. Even if it's something that feels like it resolved itself, there should be some unanswered question or some new danger or an unexpected twist that keeps the players invested for the next time. And this means every session I have 3 things written down in front of me. I have a planned encounter. I also have a goal or a beat for where the story in this session is going to go so that I know where I'm steering the ship. And then I also have a plan B for when they inevitably do the thing that I wasn't expecting, which again might just be a random encounter if I need to buy myself some time, or if I'm behind that week, I was too busy with work or whatever, and I need something for them to do, I'll throw in a random encounter and sort of improvise on the spot. And these moments, these sort of transitions into the next session could be as simple as an NPC pulling them aside and just going, hey, we need to talk in private. And it could be this really eerie moment where after the battle is over, they realize that one of the bodies is missing, or something else like that that, again, pushes the story forward. A great ending isn't going to just make players feel like the session is over, like they've accomplished one more thing, another box checked. It also makes them hungry to come back. So I never just say, okay, that's the session, see you next week. I always try to find a poignant moment, some final moment to leave a lasting impression for that session. And by ending on a note that's not quite final, right, a cliffhanger, the players are going to start to spend time between sessions thinking about what comes next and getting excited, and that's exactly what I want as a dungeon master. Having a strong structure keeps your sessions focused, but how you present the game is also what makes it truly feel like a movie rather than just a sequence of events. So there are a few things that I like to focus on to bring that cinematic quality to the table. So the first thing is framing the scene like a director. And I know, again, this is a game. Some people are yelling at me right now. Just let me explain. A movie isn't just a series of things happening, right? It's carefully constructed. It's an experience where every single shot, every angle, every moment is designed to make the audience feel something. And you can bring that same level of energy to your game by thinking about how you frame a scene. So instead of just saying you walk into the throne room, picture it like a camera shot. Is it a wide shot that's showing these like towering pillars and these golden banners that are hanging from the ceiling, making the characters feel small in the presence of this king or whatever? Or is it like a slow zoom and you're focusing on the queen's really cold, piercing gaze as she's studying them in silence? Or is it a low angle that makes the villain feel imposing? You don't need to literally describe it like a film director would. Not everybody understands those shot compositions and things like that. But by thinking in shots, by visualizing it in your head, you can subtly control how players are feeling when they enter a new space by how you describe things. This goes for action scenes, right? Don't just say that the knight swings at you. Instead, cinematize the moment, which is a word, probably. The knight's blade sings through the air. You see that the light is catching on the steel as it comes for your neck. Your sword barely deflects the first strike, but right before you can breathe, he's already bringing up his shield for a crushing blow. by framing your narration like a visual experience, players start to picture it like a movie in their heads, and that makes the game just instantly more immersive for everybody. Now, the second thing is to have dynamic pacing, right? So like slow versus fast scenes. So great movies don't just throw action at you nonstop. They know when to speed up and when to slow down. There's sort of a roller coaster effect in movies that you can actually see if you plot the points of a movie. Now, in a game, this means recognizing when it's time to linger on a moment and when it's time to kind of just get things going. So if you're in a high-stakes chase or a battle, the camera, or our heads, should be moving quickly, right? Sentences should be short and punchy, and descriptions should be fast and frantic because you don't want to pull away from those moments by monotonizing your descriptions. So instead, you want to try doing things like you hit the alleyway running, and behind you the guards are shouting orders, you hear boots slamming against the cobblestone, they're starting to gain on you, what are you doing? And when players find a moment of quiet, then that's when you can let the camera or your head slow down. So you can say things like, the fire's crackling softly in this tavern, it's kind of empty. You can hear the rain tapping against the window, the bartender's cleaning his glass, he doesn't look at you, and somewhere inside your chest you get this really uneasy feeling. By modulating your pacing, you start to create an experience that feels like a film, with tension that builds, with moments that breathe, and also high energy sequences that hit hard. And that's also something you just get better at the more that you DM. And then also the third thing is that sound and atmosphere is really, really important, right? It's sort of this unseen cinematic layer. Movies with music are kind of awkward, and that's, debatable. You can talk to me in the comments about that. But sound design is half of the experience of film, probably more. And while a D&D game isn't literally a movie, you can still tap into that same power. So using music, using sound effects and key moments makes a huge difference. When the party enters a haunted ruin, you want to have that eerie hum in the background that makes them feel more ominous. If they're in combat, switch to that fast-paced, awesome battle theme, that heightens that adrenaline for them. And if they're sitting around a campfire after a hard-fought victory, then you're playing that sound of the flames and maybe some light music, and you hear the insects. That's going to create a feeling of warmth and relief and really just pull on that immersiveness. And what's great about this is that you can actually have all of those sound effects and even your notes in one place with today's sponsor, Describe. Look, I get it. You want to be the DM that blows everyone's mind. You want to have a session so good that players can't stop bragging about you. But sadly, it just never happens. You put all of that work in, and they just do their thing. They eat their pizza, and they go home with a see you next week gang. Well, here's the trick to taking your session from just another week to holy that gave me the chills. Describe is a platform where the DM gets one subscription. Literally, if every player chipped in the price of a coffee, you could play for a whole year. And the DM builds these incredible immersive soundscapes with maps and text and ambience and music and sound effects all right there in one spot for all of the players to experience right there. And if you want to check out what I mean, click the link down below and use my code FANTASYFORGE. I literally got chills the first time I was being run through the program. I can't even imagine what it must be like for players the first time, so go check out Describe. You won't regret it. It's the secret trick you've been looking for, and if your players don't lose their minds the first time you introduce it to them, then honestly, they just don't deserve you. Now, the fourth thing is the rule of three. This rule here is to just kind of get you into the mindset of building tension like a filmmaker. So in movies, tension is often built by using a technique that's called the rule of three. Things come in sets of three. So you set something up, you escalate it, and then it pays off. So you can use that same technique in D&D to increase anticipation before a big moment. So let's say the party is about to enter this cursed temple. Instead of just saying the door creaks open, you can build that moment in 3 steps. So as they approach, they start to feel the unsettling chill in the air, like the place itself is watching them. Now when they reach the entrance, when they get to that door, their torches start to flicker unnaturally even though there's no wind, and they start to hear this weird thumping from inside. Now when they push the door open, the stone grinds against the floor, and for a brief second every sound in the world seems to stop, and then something moves inside. And when you layer tension like that, you make even those simple moments like opening a door to a temple or a ruin or whatever start to feel big and cinematic, and it really gives your players that creeping dread, the same that you get when you're watching a horror movie. And then finally, there's your character close-ups. And again, I know this doesn't quite make sense. Just stay with me here. Movies focus on faces. They focus on emotions during important moments. You can see it in pretty much any movie that you watch. Just analyze it and you'll see it. And you can do the same in your games by using character close-ups in your descriptions. So instead of saying the queen is angry, make that moment feel personal, right? Zoom in on things. The queen's knuckles whiten as she grips the armrest of her throne. You see her jaw is tightening. She's exhaling slowly through her nose. Her eyes lock onto yours with this really cold fury that immediately sends chills down your spine. And then during that intense roleplay moments, you can let everything else fade into the background and focus only on the character. Describe her breathing, describe her hands, her eyes, the way the film would zoom in on their face and on those little tiny details to emphasize the emotions. This makes the NPC interactions feel cinematic, makes them feel real because you're starting to get little tiny details onto how they act and how they react. And it also pulls players deeper into the drama of that moment, which is huge. So again, by thinking in terms of camera shots, you can really start to get a feel for how things should move simply because your brain is putting that story together for you. So just to summarize everything, once you have that first tip, which is to have Act 1, 2, and 3 sort of broken down as bullets for your session, then the next step is to make sure that the session feels like a movie, not just structured like a movie, by focusing on framing things like a director, right? Framing the scene, thinking in shots, thinking in angles and perspectives, using pacing, right? Keeping action scenes quick and punchy and letting those quiet moments breathe, using sound and atmosphere and sound effects to create descriptions for you and bring that world to life. And then also building tension with the rule of 3 by layering suspense before revealing that major moment to make it feel a little bit bigger. And then using those character close-ups to zoom in on emotions, to get in on that body language and make the interactions feel more real for the players. And when you combine all of those techniques with that strong structure that we talked about, you stop running a game that just tells a story and you start running a game that feels like one. Your players aren't just going to be playing in a world, you're going to make them see it, you're going to make them hear it, you're going to make them feel it, and that's what makes a session truly cinematic. At least that's what I think. Now, if you found this helpful, be sure to like and subscribe for more D&D and fantasy storytelling insights. And if you want to support the channel so I can keep doing this stuff, you can check out my Patreon or my World Weavers workbook on Amazon. It really goes a long way to helping me continue doing this crazy YouTube thing. But please only do that if you actually have the financial means. I'd much rather you just leave a like, leave a comment, spread the word, spread some love. That is also extremely helpful. So don't feel like you need to give the channel any money. I completely get it. Times are rough, guys. As always, thank you so much for watching. Forge on, my friends, and we'll see you next time, adventurers.